Shabbat Shalom. Another week has gone by, and I hope you've been blessed. This week we are in the Torah portion Re'eh, which is Deuteronomy 11:26 through 16:7. And this is the portion that starts with the famous verses, I set before you blessing and curse. Blessing if you obey the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, and curse if you do not obey the commandments, but turn away from the path I enjoin upon you and follow other gods when Yahweh brings you into the land. Now, I want to point out that it's very clear that these commands that are to be followed when they reach the land are not for salvation or losing salvation. They're for blessing and curse. We talked about this in a previous Torah portion. There are two kind of different sets of laws that the Father has given. And the more thorough, I don't know if thorough is the right word, but the larger number of commandments were those that were given teaching the Israelites how to live in the land and ensure that they stayed in the land rather than being banished from the land. Now, these commandments are supposed to be announced from two different mountains after they enter the land. Well, the blessing and the curse really associated with keeping them or not was to be announced from the mountains. And the blessing was to be announced from Mount Perazim, and the curse from Mount Ebal or Ebal. And the Hebrew word for Perazim means cut up or cut off. And this I found very interesting because the covenant, these are the terms and the conditions of the covenant. Part of Yahweh's covenant is that he would bring us into the land that he promised to our fathers. And so it makes sense that we must uphold the terms of the covenant in the land. We uphold our end of the covenant, he upholds his. If either is broken, then the other can't happen. And the idea of covenant has this idea of cutting up of the pieces. When the covenant was made with Abraham, remember, the burning torch walked between the pieces of the animals that Abraham had cut up and laid across from each other to make the path. And so I found that quite interesting, the connection that the blessing from obeying the terms of the covenant was read from Mount Perazim, which has this meaning or this connotation associated with its name. Now, Ebal, the curse being read from Ebal, what I could find in the Strongs related to this word is that it's an unused root, probably to be bald. And so I think that also has some significance. You're bald, you're without hair, but it can have a deeper meaning, and you can be completely bald spiritually and devoid of anything if you don't uphold the terms of the covenant. And then the portion goes into what you're supposed to do. What are these actual commands? And I think what happens a lot when Christians or non-believers or people of other religions think about this, think about the Torah, they think this stupid set of laws that are like, don't have meat and milk together, don't light fire on Sabbath, don't like something about slaves, and don't wear clothing that is made of two different threads, and they don't get it, and they're like, this is dumb, and what does it have to do with anything? Well, first of all, there are some very good reasons for those laws, but if you read the Torah portion, none of those are mentioned anywhere near the beginning. What's really critical once you enter the land, and what we see throughout this entire Torah portion, is the idea of worshiping him and only him, not being tempted to go astray and worship other gods. In fact, in chapter 12, verses 2 through 3, I'll just read it. You must destroy all the sites at which the nations you are to dispossess worshipped their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills, or under any luxuriant tree. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to the fire, and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site. So what is happening here is, in our actions, and the first thing that we're supposed to do when we enter the land, and the subsequent laws and rules, are all meant to uphold his sanctity. And remember, when Moshe and Aaron failed to do that in the sight of the community, they lost their ability to enter the land. So it only makes sense that when we are provided with the blessing and the curse, and we must choose, The commandments that are given to obtain the blessing to remain in the land involve upholding his sanctity and also separating ourselves out as a people. We should not worship any other gods. We should not allow ourselves to be tempted to stray from him. Don't believe diviners or false prophets. It even says in this portion, even if what they say comes true, if they are encouraging you to go after another god, they are false and they must be killed. Now, what I find very interesting too is that the next thing that it goes into is sacrifice, like the sacrifices, sacrificing only where he's placed his name. And what's very particular about this is the phrase that is repeated is where he has established his name, or where he will establish his name. That's where you're supposed to sacrifice. In fact, the portion is very clear. You can slaughter other animals and eat them. But if the point of the animal is a sacrifice to Yahweh, you can't just do it wherever you please. You have to do it where he's established his name. And the Hebrew word there for the English word established is shachan, and it has the idea of lodging according to the Strong's Concordance. And this makes complete sense because the whole point of the tabernacle and the land is so that he can dwell among us. And so that is the place where he dwells among us, and we can't get any closer to him than in that place. That's like the ultimate. And so that's why it's important that the sacrifices are brought there. Now, another interesting phrase that is repeated multiple times is when it's talking about other gods and how we're to refrain and stay away and destroy all the things associated with them. Another phrase that's repeated over and over is, which you have not experienced, in contrast to Yahweh, whom we have experienced. And the Hebrew word there for experience is yada. We've talked about it before. It's a very intimate connotation, meaning to know, comprehend, have knowledge. But there are a lot of potential meanings, according to Strong's, and one of the interesting ones is kinsfolk, or the idea of being related. And this makes complete sense, too, because we are called God's children, and Yeshua calls us brothers and sisters. And so it's really saying that not only is Yahweh unique because we have experienced his power and his might through the miracles that he performed to bring us out of Egypt, but also we have this ability to be related to him as kinfolk, to know him so intimately and to be family with him. And that was something very unique. That's not something that other people could say about their gods. I mean, think about the Greek gods. You have the god of love, the god of war, the god of rain. If it doesn't rain, you have to dance to try to please the god. Maybe you need to sacrifice your child to make the god stop being angry at you. And there's none of this concept of being so intimate and knowing your God so well that you could be considered a kinsfolk to him. And so that's a very unique thing that we have about our Father. Then the Torah portion goes on and it talks about different physical acts to abstain from, to remain separate to him. So this is where we go into the food, don't eat unclean animals, etc., etc. And then there is an interesting portion about the tithe. And common understanding, especially among the Christian church, is that the tithe is 10% of your money and you give it to the church, and that's the end of that. But I want to read a couple portions of scripture that suggest it's something a little bit different than that. In fact, you are supposed to enjoy your tithe, and not just anywhere you please, in the spot where Yahweh chose to establish his name. You enjoy your tithe, and you're joyful in it, and you remember that Yahweh is the one who gave you the increase so that you have it. So let's read it. Chapter 14, verse 22. You shall set aside every year a 10th part of all the yield of your sowing that is brought from the field. You shall consume the tithes of your new grain and wine and oil, the firstlings of your herd and flocks, in the presence of Yahweh your Elohim, in the place where he will choose to establish his name, so that you may learn to revere Yahweh your Elohim forever. Should the distance be too great for you, should you be unable to transport them, meaning the animals and the grain and the oil, because the place where Yahweh your Elohim has chosen to establish his name is far from you, and because Yahweh your Elohim has blessed you, you may convert them into money. Wrap up the money, take it with you, so you're still supposed to go. It's just money is easier to carry than a whole bunch of animals and grain and oil. Spend the money there once you get to the place that Yahweh your Elohim has chosen. Spend the money on anything you want. Cattle, sheep, wine, other intoxicant, anything you may desire. And you shall feast there in the presence of Yahweh your Elohim and rejoice with your household. Well, that's a new take on tithe, isn't it? It's not one that we hear about too much. So where do we get the idea that it's supposed to go to the church or the priests or the pastors? Well, the next set of verses. Do not neglect the Levite. Remember, the Levites are the priestly line in your community, for he has no hereditary portion as you have. Remember, Yahweh is his portion. Every third year, you shall bring out the full tithe of your yield of that year, but leave it within your settlement. So in this case, you're not bringing it to the place where Yahweh has established his name. And you're not partaking of it yourself and rejoicing. Instead, verse 29, the Levite, who has no hereditary portion as you have, and the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in your settlement shall come and eat their fill, so that Yahweh your Elohim may bless you in all the enterprises you undertake. And the fatherless and the widow are mentioned multiple times again in this Torah portion after this, when it talks about eating and rejoicing before Yahweh on certain feasts. And so, again, another thing that we seem to forget a lot these days, the fatherless and the widow. We're so careful to make sure we're giving money to the church or kowtowing down to the teachers. And there's nothing wrong with supporting them or thanking them. Being a teacher is not an easy job, and it even says in scripture, don't desire to do this because the teachers are judged harsher. They're in charge of the flock, so if they lead the flock astray, those repercussions can be quite serious. But the fatherless and the widow, unfortunately, not as many organizations and churches and congregations pay attention to them as they should. And it's very clear throughout Torah and throughout scripture that those people need to be taken care of, the orphans and the widows. So think about that next time that you're thinking about your tithe. And, it's not just money. Money is allowed if it's easier. But the optimal tithe was the items themselves and doing it in Yahweh's presence. And so sometimes just giving somebody some food or clothing or a blanket is a better tithe than sending your money off to an organization that's going to do who knows what with it, or just giving it to the church and assuming they're going to do what's best. I know a lot of people have different opinions on that. So again, this is just my opinion and what I've been convicted of based on what I've read in scripture. But of course, I'm willing to be chastised if necessary if I'm going down the wrong route. But this is what I've been convicted of as of today, and that's how I prefer to do my tithe. In fact, recently I've been giving some money to a teacher in Israel, lives there, just because of the COVID-19 situation has essentially obliterated his whole income. And I feel much better about doing that. I feel like I'm actually making an impact. He's fed the kingdom, and I'm feeding him. So, again, just my opinion, my personal thoughts, my conviction based on the leading that I feel I'm getting from the Spirit. So I hope you've enjoyed this portion, and as always, please feel free to discuss with me in the comments or send me an email. I'd love to hear what you've gotten out of it. Lots of different things, and different people receive different revelations at different times. So it's always good to chat with other people and see what you've gotten out of the portion for this week. So have a blessed week, and Shabbat Shalom.